Hi, everyone. I see a lot of attendees streaming in right now. Thank you for being with us. Just one logistical note before we get started. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the session, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A feature. The chat is also available to you, but we will be pulling questions exclusively from that feature. So go ahead and put them in there, and we will get to that later in the session. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you, Ellen, and welcome everyone. My name is Steve Mange. I'm Senior Policy Counsel and Interim Legislative Counsel at the North Carolina Department of Justice. So glad to have you here today for our third webinar in our Cannabis Policy webinar series. The first webinar a couple weeks ago was on health and law enforcement implications of cannabis. Last week, we talked about regulatory, sales, and taxation issues. If you missed those webinars and are interested in watching them, those are available on the same page that you went to, the DOJ Cannabis Policy webinar page to register for today's webinar. Today, in our special April Fool's Day edition of the webinar series, we're going to talk about growing and processing cannabis. And next week, on Friday, April 8th, we'll talk about racial equity issues. We are incredibly fortunate today to have a fantastic lineup of speakers. We have three speakers, each who will be speaking for about 15 minutes before we go to Q&A. And I'm just going to introduce all three of them now so as not to break the flow. Rosanna Smart is an economist at the RAND Corporation and Associate Director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center. Her research focuses on issues at the intersection of health and criminal justice, including the study of cannabis policy, illegal markets, and firearm violence. Rick Garza is the agency director of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, where he's worked for 25 years. Before he joined the agency, Rick had previously served for 13 years as a staff member for the Washington State Legislature, both on the Senate side and the House side. Rick is nationally recognized for his expertise on cannabis policy, and he serves as the first vice president of the Cannabis Regulators Association, which is also known as CANRA. Our third speaker, Van Butzik, is co-director of the Cannabis Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. That center is an interdisciplinary research group that promotes scientific research on the social and environmental dimensions of cannabis production. Van's own research uses both economics and geography to analyze the way land use decisions impact people and the environment. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to Rosanna Smart from the RAND. Rosanna.
Great, thank you. Are you seeing like the full screen slides?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for attending on an April Fool's Friday. So just to begin, I'll say I have no connections to the cannabis industry and no other conflicts of interest to declare. And the organization I work for, RAND, does not have an official position on cannabis policy. RAND's mission is to improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. Now, I actually think this webinar series as a whole really highlights the variety of considerations that are involved in implementing cannabis policy. This includes public health and public safety, which were touched on in the first session, social equity and restorative justice, which will be touched on in the next session. And today I'm going to focus a bit more on some of the economic implications of establishing a legal source of cannabis supply. So kind of first, and maybe foremost on a lot of people's minds, there are revenues to the state. These are going to primarily come from taxes, licensing and license application fees, other fees such as inspection fees, and fines for compliance violations. Some portion of these revenues are needed to cover the cost of operating the program and enforcing program rules and regulations. To the extent that there are excess revenues above and beyond that, state laws will typically dictate what those revenues can be used for. So in some states, those excess revenues are directed just to the general state fund. In other states, they're kind of targeted to specific areas, commonly substance use disorder treatment or cannabis-related research. In addition to revenues to the state, you're kind of creating a new industry. And so there's kind of clear opportunities for employment and industry growth. And we can think of this as occurring across various segments of the supply chain for cannabis, including cultivators or growers, manufacturers and processors, testing facilities, as well as distributors and retailers. Now, I feel like the economic implications of cannabis policy are more commonly discussed in the context of non-medical cannabis legalization, but they also matter for medical legalization, even if that's all the state is considering. First, there are opportunities for economic growth, even within the smaller cannabis markets that we tend to see in states that have only legalized. But second, the market and industry structures that are put into place under medical regimes commonly lay the groundwork for how non-medical supply ends up being structured and regulated. So before getting into some of the options states have for regulating cannabis supply, I thought it would be instructive to just kind of briefly go over what the general kind of cannabis supply chain looks like. This is a simplified depiction, but I think it's a good starting point. So basically, cultivators are going to use the raw materials to grow the cannabis plants, either in outdoor, indoor, or mixed light settings. The cannabis plant is then harvested and dried and processed for use in flower product, or it undergoes extraction for use in concentrates or edibles. Around this stage in the process, the cannabis is typically tested for potency and potential contaminants. The packaged product is then distributed to consumers, commonly through medical dispensaries or retail outlets. And so most states are going to license, the actors in each of the actors in these steps of the supply chain, because they want to monitor kind of the cannabis supply in the state. Kind of outside of the direct supply chain, we see in states that have legalized cannabis, the rise of these kind of ancillary businesses that aren't directly involved in the supply of cannabis, but that provide services to suppliers. So these can include firms that provide consulting services, advertising agencies, security service companies. These are typically not subject to licensing by the state, and they're kind of outside the more stringent monitoring that suppliers have to undergo, but they represent another avenue for economic growth. So that overall industry structure, kind of that general structure, the specifics of what it looked like in a given state are going to be shaped on the legal supply regime that state puts into place. And here states have a variety of options. And I'm kind of echoing a slide that you probably saw from Bo Kilmer last week. So we have a range of options for how we regulate cannabis supply. They can be as kind of restrictive as just only allowing patients or consumers to grow their own cannabis, or only allowing small scale co-ops, or they can kind of on the other end be more like a standard commercial model, or like an entirely unregulated commercial model. While there are these kind of spectrum of options, what we've seen in the US at least is that states typically are choosing from among a smaller subset of these. And the different choices states make, again, are going to shape kind of what the market looks like and what the economic opportunities are. So the different choices states make are arguably reflecting kind of different trade-offs that are seen across each of these supply regimes. So for example, if we think about states that either allow home cultivation or prohibit home cultivation, which at this point in cannabis policy is typically a layer on top of a dispensary framework. Allowing home cultivation gives patients and consumers kind of more flexibility in their cannabis supply sources, but it creates pretty large challenges, if not impossibilities, for the state in actually monitoring the full scope of legal cannabis supply in the state. Another area where states are making different choices is the extent to which suppliers in medical markets are required to operate as not-for-profits. So there are several states that do require medical cannabis suppliers to be nonprofits. I think the theoretical benefit here is that nonprofits should be less incentivized to encourage kind of excessive or problematic use among their customers. The trade-off is kind of requiring this nonprofit status is typically going to slow market growth and may kind of slow economic gains that can be achieved because it's difficult for these businesses to get capital and there's just lower competitive pressures. And then finally, I'll just briefly note that state-run stores, while these haven't been implemented yet in any state, are currently being discussed as an option in New Hampshire's bill. And if you're interested in knowing more about the trade-offs of kind of a state-run store model, I will refer you to Bo Kilmer's excellent presentation last week, where he kind of delved into those issues. So a lot of talk is given around, I think, these choices across supply regimes, but it's also really important to consider the decisions you're making within a given supply regime. So even if a state has decided it's going to go with kind of a commercial model, there's a number of decisions that can be made that will shape what the market looks like. This can include both kind of restrictions on the number of licensees, caps on overall market size, or caps on how large any given business or canopy is allowed to be. And then an area where states really have made different choices is around vertical integration. So we've had some states that have banned or limited the extent to which suppliers can be vertically integrated, and other states that actually require suppliers be vertically integrated. So what is vertical integration? Vertical integration is essentially when you've consolidated two or more steps of the supply chain under one business. So here is just an example where I'm thinking about a relatively fully vertically integrated company as one company that's going to do the cultivation, it's going to do the processing and manufacturing, and it's also going to be in charge of retail sales. We can think of this in contrast to an industry where business growth typically occurs due to horizontal integration. So here, the different steps on the supply chain remain segmented, but companies can consolidate with other companies on their same level. So we can have cultivators that merge with other cultivators, or retailers that merge with other retailers, but companies remain specialized in their kind of step in the supply chain. So as I said, states are making different choices about the extent to which they want their cannabis markets to be vertically integrated. Some states require it, some states ban or limit it, and some states actually just kind of leave it up to companies to decide and are silent on the matter. Given this is a relatively new industry, I think a lot of these decisions have to rely on either evidence from other markets about the effects of vertical integration or theory around what the pros and cons of vertical integration are, rather than direct empirical evidence from cannabis markets about the benefits and costs of vertical integration. So just kind of thinking about theoretically some of the trade-offs of requiring or encouraging vertical integration, there are a few key kind of pros in theory. So one is the idea that by bringing everything in-house, vertically integrated companies can improve efficiencies and generate cost savings to the company, although it's kind of an open question whether those cost savings get passed down to the consumer. Second, by requiring retailers to grow their own product, this should discourage sourcing from black market channels and may facilitate regulation and monitoring, since there are fewer businesses to monitor. And finally, by centralizing control of production from beginning to end, companies have full control over their product quality, which again, in theory, should increase product consistency. That said, there are also kind of several key drawbacks, and you'll see these first two bullet points kind of contradict each other. But basically, the idea that vertical integration improves efficiencies may not actually hold true if there are productivity gains from specialization. So thinking about cannabis markets with like a requirement for vertical integration, you're requiring farmers to act as retailers and retailers to act as farmers, and this can actually create production inefficiencies, which could increase costs to companies. So again, this is kind of the extent to which vertical integration is more efficient or less efficient kind of depends on the specific market you're looking at. Second, establishing a vertically integrated business, it requires pretty large, pretty substantial startup costs and capital requirements. This can slow market growth and basically be prohibitively costly for small scale companies to enter or survive in the market. Relatedly, by encouraging a small number of large scale companies to dominate a market, vertical integration can discourage competition, which can result in higher prices to the consumer. Furthermore, very large scale suppliers, if they get substantial market power, they may be more influential in shaping regulations to their own benefit or in finding ways to evade regulations. Finally, and kind of related to the points above, requirements for vertical integration limit who's able to participate in the market as a supplier. vertical integration requirements are likely to favor larger scale multi-state operators who have existing resources and experience that allow them to vertically integrate. So this can reduce the diversity of suppliers that you see in the market. So while those are the theoretical pros and cons, there has recently been some, I'll say, albeit limited evidence that requiring or heavily incentivizing vertical integration in cannabis markets may have more drawbacks than benefits. So there's a working paper published last year by Ben Hansen and colleagues that studied vertical integration just of cultivators and processors, which is allowed in Washington State's market. And the evidence they show suggests that vertical integration actually created production inefficiencies that were particularly costly for small companies that tried to integrate. And the one on the, I guess it's the right, in Florida's medical market, which requires vertical integration, they faced some issues in getting licensees up and running, and some have attributed that to kind of onerous vertical integration requirements. I'll also note that at least as of last time I looked, which was probably mid-2021, Florida's medical cannabis market was really largely dominated by 3 multi-state companies that had more than 50% market share. I think at this point, there's like 1 company that has more than 50% market share. Again, showing, I think this highlights the potential for vertical integration to really favor these large scale companies. And then finally, a couple of years ago, MedMen, which is a popular multi-state cannabis chain, announced it would be, at least in some states, moving away from its prior strategy of vertical integration. They saw the market as moving towards one in which it was more efficient to operate, to be more specialized in one area of the supply chain or another. So they were going to begin outsourcing kind of the growing and producing and focusing on retail operations. So again, these are just kind of some evidence, at least from some states, that vertical integration may not have the theoretical pros that we might think it will, but it remains to be seen, I think, as a whole. It's a decision that the state needs to make, but these should be kept in mind. So I've been talking about kind of more explicit rules and regulations that are put around kind of what the market structure has to look like. But there are also ways that regulations can implicitly shape the market. And I think these merit careful attention as well. So first are just barriers to entry. So having high application and licensing fees or requiring kind of other sources of capital can limit the ability of small companies to participate in the market. Other barriers to entry, such as prohibitions for individuals with certain criminal histories, may limit applicant diversity and have social equity implications. I increasingly think it's also important to be really attentive to the license application requirements and processes for scoring applications and awarding licenses. So some states actually award extra points to applicants who have existing within state operations. For example, in South Carolina's proposed cannabis bill, they award extra points to existing agricultural businesses and companies in the hemp industry who have operated for more than 2 years in the state. They also require that the applicants submit a plan to hire employees from within the community where they'll be operating. So these are both designed to be directly supportive of local businesses. Whereas language in some other state bills, such as language that requires demonstrated expertise specific to medical cannabis, can actually force local businesses to partner with out-of-state companies, just because if you're establishing a new medical cannabis industry, it's hard to demonstrate that you have the expertise, given it was prohibited prior. Finally, I'll just say licensing structure can also shape who enters the market. So some states have different licenses and different license fees for different cultivation sizes. Other states kind of only allow vertical integration among small companies to try to limit that market power issue. So these are all options and things that should be considered. And finally, just to take a step back, I think it's beneficial to think about what the policy goals you have are, and in particular to think about like what you want the market to look like. This can include like how big do you want or need your market to be? Here, I think it's instructive to think about what demand is likely to be given the scope of qualifying patients and given the context of the state, and then try to get supply to match up as close to that as possible. And second is who do you want participating in the market? Not just thinking about the number of businesses, but whether you want to favor larger or smaller scale producers, whether you want to favor kind of multi-state operators or local businesses, and the extent to which you want a diversity of suppliers and on what dimensions you want diversity to be represented. And I'm going to skip past this slide because I know I'm at time and just conclude that, like, I don't think I need to tell most people here, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made. These are complex, but there are economic gains to be experienced. Even if that's not the primary goal of policy, it's important to think about how those economic gains will be distributed. And I think these last two bullet points Rick Garza will touch on. So I'll just conclude there and not go over my time, but thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rosanna, for that excellent presentation. We're now going to turn to Rick Garza. Rick, the floor is yours.
Great to be with you today. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, the audio is good.
I've got a number of topics I was asked to speak to, and I kind of want to walk from where Rosanna was in some of the information that she provided. Interesting enough, we use the RAND Corporation as one of our subcontractors to determine how much production we would need in our state, and Bo Kilmer was the person that we worked directly with. I'll share a little bit more about that, but I want to talk about the whole issue of horizontal versus vertical. And Rosanna was touching upon some of the pros and cons of that. And we've had, it's hard to believe, 10 years in November since our adult use program was approved by voters, I-502. And so just so you know how the states can be very different in the approaches that they use, Allison Holcomb was the policy director in Washington that wrote I-502, and she was the state director of the ACLU. And what she did was she looked at the model for alcohol regulation coming out of Prohibition in 1934 and basically used that same model for cannabis and basically gave it to what was at that time the Liquor Control Board in Washington State, now the Liquor and Cannabis Board, and she did not allow for vertical integration. Soon after the initiative, as we began to write rules, we specifically asked her, what was your intent in not allowing vertical integration? She said the same reasons that we didn't allow it in alcohol coming out of Prohibition. We didn't want large companies to control the marketplace. So a manufacturer of alcohol could have no financial interest, direct or indirect, in a retailer, and the distributor was placed in the middle. So that was the whole idea, was we wanted smaller grows in the state of Washington. We have in-state residency requirements for 6 months, but the idea there was to allow for as many to enter the marketplace. Now, some of the pros and cons of that over time, and I'll go back to the alcohol industry for a moment. In the 70s and 80s in Washington, and we're the second largest wine producer in the country, some of our smaller wineries could not get to market because of the inability to have a vertical integration. And so what happened is they had to go to the legislature to get the ability to self-distribute and retail. And because of that, the wine industry grew in our state to where it is today with almost over 1,000 wineries in our state. The reason I bring that up is the con of not allowing vertical integration is many of our small growers have a very difficult time getting to market. And we've actually introduced legislation to allow, like we did for wineries and breweries, the ability for them to be vertically integrated. In fact, I think the model that really works well is the Oregon model. Oregon allows you to do either. You can be a grower, a processor, a retailer, or you can be one of those. It seems like that's probably a better program to allow for that, because we put limits on production. So you can be no larger than 30 square feet of canopy, and there's 3 different tiers that we put together. So we hired Bo Kilmer as our consultant, who did one thing that was really important: determine what the consumption of cannabis is in the state for those over 21. And in the original work that Bo did, I believe it was 40 metric tons. And from there, we built our production to that, to try to get to that number. In fact, we had so many people that applied, we had to reduce the number of individuals that could hold production licenses or cultivators. And so you can only hold 3 licenses for production in our state. And we've capped those, and we did that very early on. And so you can only hold 3 producer licenses person, sole proprietor company, you can only hold 5 retail licenses in our state. The idea there, again, is to allow as many different individuals and companies to get into the marketplace and not have 1 or 3 or 5 particular industry members controlling the marketplace. And so I think that model has served well for us. It allows for a lot more companies. And then we have a 6-month in-state residency requirement that still is on the books. If you're looking at what you'd want to do there, I would think even longer residency requirements if you're trying to create an in-state industry, maybe because we had people come in early to set up that residency for 6 months that were out of state that then could meet the in-state requirement. So I would consider maybe 2 or 3 years of residency required if you're going to go that route. I talked a little bit about the production limits and caps that we have. The question that I saw was, so what if you don't create? Well, you can go talk to my friend who is a director, Steve Marks in Oregon, where they don't have production limits. And what they're dealing with is an incredible amount of overproduction where they've had to cut off the number of licenses. So I think, one of the advices that I would give is, first of all, look and try to determine what the consumption is in your state, whether it's medical or adult use, and then build your system from there. Start slowly, and then you can always increase it in time. One of the things that I'd also share is that you need to take the time to create your program. We were given a year when the initiative passed for us to develop our rules. For instance, Colorado opened up 6 months before Washington, yet they dealt with issues that we didn't have to deal with because we had taken the time, I think, to not only work with law enforcement, public health, and local elected officials with respect to what our program would look like, but also gave us time to work with the industry that was here that was illicit. So unfortunately, we had a medical program that was unregulated for 10 years in our state. It actually took 2 years to bring medical under adult use. And in our state, both of those systems live together in one retail shop. There are medical consultants that provide guidance to patients, but it's one program. There's some pros and cons to that. I won't cover today unless there are questions with respect to that. But that was what you're doing in North Carolina. I guess what I've learned from looking at the other states as a member of CANRA and the work that we've done with other states is it would only make sense to begin with a very conservative, restrictive program for medical, more like a pharmacy or a board with medical recommendations than to do it the route we did. We had very little regulations. Anyone could get an authorization. It basically, our medical program in Washington, before it was changed in 2016, basically allowed a commercial venture where people could use it for adult use and for medical. So I would suggest that you take the time, which most legislatures and governors don't want to give you. They want, once it's approved, they want the program in place. I would take the time to set up a system because you're going to need a number of staff. We're fortunate in the Liquor Cannabis Board here. We have 344 employees, one of the larger cannabis programs in the state. We also do alcohol, vape, and tobacco in our state. But I would suggest that you take the time to work with the industry and to work with others in determining your regulations and not be in a hurry, which most of the other states are when it is legalized either for medical or for adult use. I think I've covered the areas that I was asked to speak to. So I will hand it back to you, Steve, unless you have anything else you think I should cover.
No, that's fantastic. We really appreciate your taking the time to share your experience in Washington. Very instructive, and we hope that that may have generated some questions. But in the meantime, before we get to questions, I'd like to turn things over to our third and final speaker, Van Butzik. Van, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about cannabis and the environment, and really some considerations that lawmakers should be thinking about before they enact the legislation or build the regulations around some legislation. And most of what I'm going to talk about is coming from our experience in California, where we've been researching cannabis and the environment for almost a decade now. So I am a faculty member at UC Berkeley and one of the co-directors of the Cannabis Research Center. And as Steve said, we basically promote interdisciplinary research about cannabis. And why we like the interdisciplinary approach is we think that when you look at one aspect of cannabis and you start to sort of regulate and put policy around it, you'll notice that it has impacts that sort of reverberate around all of these other parts of the system. So we try to look at it sort of as a full systems approach. I'd encourage you, if you have questions on any of these things, to visit our website. We have all of our research is there. A lot of it we have written into policy briefs and science briefs. We have a number of videos, and we really lay out sort of our vision of cannabis as a crop that can work both for humans and for nature. So basically looking at it as an agricultural crop where the environment thrives, people thrives, and the industry thrives as well. Okay, so from the perspective of cannabis and the environment, the first thing you really need to think about is what type of cannabis production you're going to allow. So we typically think of legal cannabis production as spanning a gradient from indoor facilities to outdoor facilities, with mixed light, which are sort of greenhouse type facilities somewhere in the middle. And if we think about the environmental impacts of cannabis across this gradient, we can think about areas where we might want to regulate these different types of production differently. So indoor systems are typically closed systems, which means that it's quite easy actually to track all the inputs and all the outputs from a facility, right? These are big warehouse facilities typically, and you know how much water is going in, how much energy is going in, and you can track how much product is coming out. These systems typically are highly energy intensive, and I'll touch on this a little bit later. They have low permeability to the outside. So what I mean by that is that there's no real impact, say, to wildlife. There's no deer walking through your indoor facility, and you're not really worried about sort of interfering with birds or bugs or insects that might be in the natural ecosystems. From a water perspective, these indoor facilities are typically on municipal water sources. So there sometimes can be some sort of interesting impacts to the municipal water source insofar as being able to deal with an increase in water demand and sometimes in sort of the effluent from the indoor facilities. But we're not dealing with water sort of interacting with nature. And the land use issues concerning indoor cannabis use are usually sort of urban land issues, right? Is there space to grow it? Who's going to build the facility, etc. Outdoor cannabis use is quite different, right? This is an open system, and to a large extent, all of our research shows that outdoor cannabis growth is pretty much like any other type of agriculture. There's nothing sort of particularly environmentally concerning about growing cannabis outdoors. So we have low energy inputs, high permeability, right? So nature is interacting with this. Your deer and your birds and your bugs are walking through the cannabis fields. It's going to use rural water sources. So you're going to have outdoor grows are typically going to be on well water or drawing water directly from the environment. And you're going to have rural land use issues. So same as permitting for maybe other agricultural activities, you might think about permitting for cannabis. So the first real decision lawmakers need to think about is, well, do we want to allow all of these forms of cultivation? Do we want to only do indoor? Do we want to only do outdoor? And there's trade-offs amongst those decisions. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is chemical use in cannabis production. So this is the fertilizers, the herbicides, the pesticides that might be used when growing cannabis. And what we found in California is that most of the chemical use by cannabis producers is actually regulated by the health and safety testing regime that's in place. And so California has pretty stringent testing for health and safety. And so the grower has to be concerned about any residue left on the cannabis flower or whatever part of the plant they're trying to sell. And basically what this has done is this has made it so that the regulations sort of at the field level are not as important as the regulations at the lab level to some degree. Interestingly, in California, cannabis farmers have sort of proved effective at managing these high standards. So when the standards went into place around 2018, we talked to lots of farmers who were struggling to meet these standards. They were getting tests back that were showing residual chemicals in the cannabis flower. Over the years, they've developed techniques to actually grow cannabis without the testing being a huge hurdle. Although, of course, there are still some failures. So lawmakers really have to consider whether chemicals should be regulated at the farm or at the lab. That is, do you want to try to monitor what farmers are doing when they're growing the cannabis, or do you want to rely on the health and safety standards to sort of account for chemical use in cannabis? The next area I want to touch on is cannabis as a nuisance. And, this gets a lot less press than sort of bigger conversations about cannabis and sort of the harms, potential health and perhaps social harms from certain uses of cannabis or crime related to cannabis production. But if you're a local government official, probably the main thing your constituents are going to complain about is actually the smell of cannabis farms. And so the picture here is a picture of Santa Barbara. We have a high school, and most of these greenhouses that you see, not all of them, but a number of them are growing cannabis. You can also see a residential community right here. And cannabis farms smell like cannabis. It can be quite strong at some parts of the year, depending on the harvesting cycle. And so a question that lawmakers really need to think about is you need to decide if growing cannabis is really an agricultural activity or if it's something different. So at least in California, we have lots of right to farm laws. So if you're a dairy farmer and you have a manure and your manure stinks, your neighbor can't do much about it. That's just sort of a normal thing you do while you're having a dairy farm, is having manure. And so if it stinks, well, that's tough luck. We haven't really decided how this applies to cannabis yet. But it's a decision that would be well served to make early on in the process, because this actually has been a contentious issue in many residential areas around the state. The next thing I want to talk about is cannabis and energy use. So indoor cannabis production requires massive amounts of energy use. And cannabis can limit municipalities' abilities to meet greenhouse gas emission goals. And so what we've seen in California is we're not regulating sort of electricity use for cannabis any different than any other electricity use, but we have seen a number of states where there is actually regulation around the electricity use for cannabis that's slightly different than for other industries, with the idea that it's a high intensive energy crop, and that we want to make sure that we can meet our greenhouse gas emission goals even while having cannabis production. The second picture here is actually diesel generators outside of a production facility in Oakland. And this is another issue that you have within indoor grows, which is that if the power fails, sometimes these huge generators are brought in, they're burning diesel next to homes, and there's fumes and toxins and everything else. And so, as lawmakers, when you're thinking about the regulations, you have to decide really if you want to regulate electricity for cannabis use differently from other industries. We've seen it happen in some states, other states we haven't. In California, local governments have very strong control over where cannabis can be produced and sort of how cannabis can be produced. And that was part of sort of Prop 64, which created the adult use market, was that it gave local governments a lot of say in basically how cannabis could be produced. So local governments have the ability to develop local land use ordinances. They have the ability to cap the number of permits for environmental reasons. There's also state agencies that can put caps in certain geographical areas for certain environmental purposes. And in fact, governments can totally ban cannabis production outright. And that's actually the case in most of California. So although it's legal to grow cannabis in California and you can go through the permitting process, if your county government or your municipal government does not allow cannabis growing, you can't obtain the local permit, which is necessary to actually be a legal producing cannabis producer. And so, there's trade-offs in this, and lawmakers have to decide who will be controlling the permitting. Are the local governments going to have a role in permitting? What we've seen in California is that's given local governments a lot of autonomy to enact local legislation or local regulation that is, meets the needs of their communities. We've also seen that that's sort of had very strange distributional effects on where cannabis is being grown in the state. The final topic I want to talk about from the environmental perspective is sort of water use. This is probably a larger issue in California, perhaps, than in other states because we have seasonal droughts in the Mediterranean climate. But the main issue I want to bring up here is, well, two things. First of all, if you have people growing outdoor cannabis and you're wondering how much water it uses, it's essentially like tomatoes. If you want sort of a metric in your head. But the main issue is, are you going to regulate water use for cannabis different than water for other agricultural crops? And that's what we've done in California is we sort of regulate water use, the water rights associated with cannabis differently than we do for other farmers. And that's caused some real issues. And so I think as you're thinking about your state's regulation and you're thinking about production, you really have to be asking this question on the waterfront. Is water use for cannabis different than water use for other agricultural crops, and should it be regulated differently or in the same way? So finally, within all of these areas of regulating environmental performance with cannabis, we see policy trade-offs. And the big trade-off we see in California is sort of twofold. First of all, the high standards increase the cost of compliance. And in a state like California, where there's a huge number of legacy farmers that were already growing cannabis before adult use was legal, this really incentivized non-permitted production. So we made really strong environmental standards, and that was part inability to meet these standards, or a fear of trying to meet the standards, or the cost of meeting these standards meant that a huge number of farmers just didn't engage with the legal market. So they're just continued to grow cannabis without permits in California. The other thing that we've seen in California is that the large farms are much better able to meet the high cost of regulations. And so what we've seen in California is farm size has consistently been increasing over time. We do have some regulations in California that somewhat limit farm size, but you're allowed to own multiple permits. And so it doesn't really have any very limited effect, although local control, of course, plays a part in this as well. But what we've seen, because these large farms are better able to meet the high cost of regulation, we see a world now in California where about 10% of the largest farms have about 60% of the acreage in outdoor production in California. And this is actually not unlike most agricultural crops. If you were to look at wine grapes, if you were to look at almonds in California, the distribution is actually quite similar, where we have a small number of large farms that control most of the acreage. And so in the California cannabis market, we've now seen that role. We've now seen that distribution of ownership as well. And so lawmakers have to try to find this balance between incentivizing legal production and having high standards. And from our experience in California, finding that balance is quite challenging and something we haven't really found here yet. And I think with that, I'll end my comments and look forward to a discussion.
Thank you so much, Fan. Really appreciate that excellent presentation. And thanks to all three of our speakers for all of the great information that's been presented today. I'm pleased to say we have 13 or 14 minutes for questions. I think at least a couple have come in already. And so let me turn to my colleague, Greg Sabin, who is going to share questions that have come in so far. Before Greg starts though, we do have time. And so if there are things rattling around in your head from what you've heard today, please feel free to put those in the Q&A function. Greg?
Thanks, Steve. Our first question, how safe is it to favor in-state interests over out-of-state interests in issuing licenses to sell marijuana when 3 lower federal courts have found that the Dormant Commerce Clause prevents that?
I think that question was for me, and it was from Pat, who I feel like Pat Oglesby, who was actually at last week's webinar, who I think was better qualified to answer this question than me. So thanks, Pat. So I think he's right to point out that there are limits on the extent to which in-state versus out-of-state operators can be given preferential treatment. I think for a while, this hasn't really been challenged because of the federal ban. So I feel like states have had kind of an excuse to try to keep everything within state. But Pat points out this has been challenged, and states have been making changes, I think, around residency requirements because of those challenges. So I think if the federal law changes, like everything changes. But in the absence of a change in the federal law, I'll just say, like, I'm a simple economist, not a lawyer. So I'm not sure where these lines around what counts as state protectionism and is unconstitutional get drawn. See, it seems to me, so in light of the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, states are going to be limited, like definitely going to face these limitations in the extent to which they explicitly discriminate against kind of out-of-state operators. I think there may still be regulations that implicitly favor local businesses that would pass the Pike balancing test of kind of being kind of protective of local regulations, but not unduly or excessively like prohibiting out-of-state operators. So it may be that there's more of those implicit regulations, though again, as there are more profits to be had, those will get challenged. And I'm just not qualified to speak to the extent to which the DCC will come into play there. But it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that is definitely a tricky issue. And as you say, Rosanna, one that the dynamic there is likely to change if there's any federal action on the legalization of cannabis. Did any other panelists want to comment on that? All right.
I thought Rosanna covered it well, which is if you don't have interstate commerce, I think it's less of a problem. I think once prohibition is lifted, states are, because in the alcohol space, you're seeing all these court cases with respect to residency requirements. So I think once that happens, I mean, we don't even allow out-of-state ownership in our state. Many of the states do, but we don't in Washington state. So I think it's a good question. I think it's problematic if the federal prohibition is lifted, but we haven't seen it in our state. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both for that. Greg?
Has any research been done on the real estate price impacts of indoor versus outdoor grow-focused policies?
I can speak to that a little bit. So we actually have a current grant looking at some of those questions, and we've done part of the work, and the part of the work we've done so far is to look at the impact on sort of local permitting in rural areas. So what we've seen in rural areas is essentially where local governments have decided to allow permitting, and oftentimes they'll have things like, oh, the parcel has to be so big, it has to be so far from a school, it has to have soil types, of certain qualities, where the parcels that allow cannabis increase in property prices, which is perhaps not surprising at all. But so we do see sort of a positive impact of property prices for rural cannabis permitting. We have not yet looked at sort of this question, especially in the area where I think it's going to be really interesting, which is our next research project, which is on sort of this, on the residential fringe, where there's homes and they're next to cannabis farms and how that plays out. We have not completed that research yet, and I don't know if anybody else has.
Thanks. And I actually want to piggyback on that question and ask Rick a question about indoor versus outdoor cultivation. How has that played out in Washington? Is most of the is it mostly indoor, mostly outdoor, or a combination of the two?
It's a mix. It's interesting that initially we almost did not allow outdoor grows. And I think it was more political because the east side of the state is pretty conservative, and we have bans and moratorias And believe it or not, the bias for cannabis is still there today. But even so, when we first began, where there were concerns about outdoor grows, well, we know that there's a carbon footprint for indoor grows. So the governor's office and others decided in our agency that we would allow for both. And so you have some of the larger grows in Eastern Washington that are outdoor grows, and certainly a lot less expensive than an indoor growing. So there's a question about impacts of cost and stuff. So we allow both, and certainly a lot cheaper to grow outdoors or a greenhouse or loop houses than indoors.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Greg, do we have other questions?
Yeah, and I'll go out of order briefly, just because this is relevant to what y'all were just talking about. Are there fire or explosion risks with indoor grows?
I'm not aware of any. I think the only risk that I've seen from sort of fire or explosion has been in the manufacturing side, but that's also typically sort of at unregulated manufacturing, people trying to do things they don't really know how to do. I'm not sure it's a huge threat sort of when done by legal entities.
Yeah, it's really about extraction. That's where these accidents occur, explosions occur. Very few in our state, as long as you're doing it, and you're approved by us because it's a regulated extraction. But that's where it happens. If it happens, it's in that extraction model that's used.
Thanks. Greg?
How would you recommend starting a cannabis research company in an illegal state to get things started?
I'm not sure. It may depend on what type of research you're doing. Right. So if it's going to be research that involves having access to the cannabis plant, you're going to face some difficulties. If it's research around kind of cannabis policy or kind of how to be a consulting firm for a cannabis business, that shouldn't violate any of the laws in your state. Again, I'm not a lawyer. But so I think the answer to that question, which I don't know if I'd have a good answer for you regardless, is going to depend on exactly what type of research is being asked about.
Yeah, and we've been almost 10 years now a legal state for adult use and medical, and we still have the whole issue that you just spoke of, Rosanna, about touching the plant because of the federal prohibition. There's very little research being done in our state, and we've been legal. So in an illegal state, and basically you look at the largest educational institutions, UW and WSU, the administration's very reluctant to do any kind of research with the major colleges. And you think of WSU, they're an agricultural school, so they should be doing a lot of research, but they're reluctant to do it because of federal prohibition. And so the question was about, what about in an illegal state? I'd share with you, there's very little we can do in the legal states of touching the plant, unless, as you said, Rosanna, it's more about policy. There's many policy schools that have been created at UW and WSU, but they're not able to touch the plant.
Thanks. Greg?
Is it possible to have separate regulation for personal use, including personal plant growing, just like individuals can brew their own beer?
Yes, and that has been done. So early medical cannabis laws, like way back when, often only allowed home cultivation. So only the patient had to home cultivate, or they could designate a caregiver, let's say, to cultivate for them. And I think DC's non-medical legalization was originally like a home cultivation only regime. Now, it's less common now. You could certainly do it. It's certainly an option. There's always been the unspoken, well, how did you get the plant or how did you get the seeds, right? That states have just basically ignored. But yes, it's perfectly possible to have that separate regulation. Again, I think it creates difficulties for potential diversion. And so I think states have kind of steered away from it due to concerns around you can't monitor all the patients. It creates kind of a regulatory nightmare, and maybe Rick can talk about that a bit more, but it is possible.
Yeah, I think most of the states have learned, at least for medical, that you just have to reduce the number of plants that you can grow. Early on, I think Colorado had like a 60 plant limit, which wasn't realistic. And so they had to bring that down. But, you know, most of the states, like in Washington state, you can create a co-op. You can grow your own for medical, just a few plants. I think that's what most of the states are doing. And on adult use, most of the states allow home grows. We're one of the few states in the country that doesn't allow home grows for adult use. And we've not even, we don't even oppose that legislation, but it just doesn't move, which continues to tell you after 10 years that even the blue states that have legalized cannabis, there's still folks that are really concerned about home grows. And I think it's really was about diversion to begin with. But like I said, many of the states allow 3 to 6 plants for home grows. I don't really see that as a threat to diversion. People do that now, whether it's legal or not. So I think it's really about how you limit the number of plants that an individual could do it for medical or for adult use.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
What are some of the environmental and safety issues with regard to extraction and processing?
I mean, from the environmental side, one of the issues we run into in California is there's not really good methods to deal with the waste. And it's not that the waste is necessarily harmful, but you actually have if you're talking about millions of pounds of cannabis flower, then think about how many pounds of cannabis plant that is. It's like actually just a ton of biomass. And we still don't actually have really great systems to dispose of that because, it's federally illegal if you're driving around with it in your dump truck or whatever. So, some of these issues from an environmental sides of how we deal with waste are sort of still not well thought out, at least in California. And I'm not really an expert in health and safety, so maybe I'll pass that on to someone else.
Rick, any comments on the health or safety issues?
We've got pretty strict regulations in place for how you can extract. And so you might want to just email me, rick.garza@lcb.wa.gov, and I'll have staff send that to you. I wouldn't be able to go into the details of it, but there's only certain ways that you can extract in our state. And before it was legal, we know of examples of how it was being done that wasn't safe. So we do have that in our regs, and we've not had much of a problem with respect to extraction as long as people follow the regs.
Great, and that is going to be our final question. We're at time, so let me again thank all of you who joined us today, and really give a warm thanks to our presenters, Rosanna, Rick, and Van. This, along with the other webinars, will be recorded and will be available on the same page that you went to register for the series. So with that, I hope everybody has a great afternoon and a great weekend. Thank you so much.